Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that makes your modern central heating look like a cruel joke. You trudge through villages blanketed in snow, so thick it muffles even your own footsteps, your breath fogging the frozen air, and the wooden doors of every home rattle as the wind howls like a pack of wolves on steroids. You probably won't survive this if you underestimate the cold. But let's be honest, you're not actually here to freeze. You're here to feel in your bones while nestled under your blanket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead, I'll wait while you do that. Also, post your location and local time below. I'm curious who else is living dangerously comfortably. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside, and the crunch of frost under your boots is deafening in the otherwise silent dawn. Smoke spirals lazily from chimneys, the color of ash and coffee creamer swirled together. Every villager you pass wraps tighter in layers of wool, linen, and whatever animal hides they could scrounge. Historians still argue whether these early towns were better at surviving the cold than their nomadic predecessors. But you notice a pattern. Survival demanded attention to the smallest details. Your scarf, your mittens, even the angle of your body against the wind. Your eyes catch the frost-laden river, still flowing beneath a fragile layer of ice. You watch as someone, probably braver or more desperate than you, pushes a thin wooden sled across the sheet, balancing bundles of firewood precariously. Fringe accounts whisper that some people used to carve ice tunnels to shield themselves from the wind, and you squint at the scene, imagining how absurdly cold it must have been to sleep in one. The air smells metallic from frozen clay roofs, mixed with faint smoke, and you shiver not just from cold, but from imagining nights spent here with nothing but shared blankets and hope. You notice children playing warily in the snow, their cheeks swollen pink, throwing compacted snowballs with precision, tiny vials of warmth in their laughter. Villagers carry buckets of water, often from frozen wells, balancing on cobblestones slick with black ice. Historians still argue whether these early communities consciously designed their daily routines around cold survival, or if it was more chaotic, a trial-and-error ballet that eventually stuck. As you wander past small cottages, you notice patterns in the architecture. Low ceilings to trap heat, thick walls to block gusts, and tiny windows barely large enough to see outside. Fringe tales suggest some houses even had underground sleeping pits lined with straw to hold heat. You peer inside, one door cracked just enough to see a fire pit sputtering weakly, and the smell of smoke curls around your nose like a warning. Don't get too close, or you'll inhale half the day's ration of warmth. The wind cuts through your coat, and you hug yourself instinctively. A dog shivers by a doorway, nose pressed against the frost, waiting for scraps. You think of how people of the past endured this, night after night, relying on fires that were sometimes barely more than embers. Historians still argue whether sheer human adaptability or strict routines mattered most in these long, frozen stretches. You crouch for a moment, tracing a pattern in the frost-crusted ground. The frozen puddles crack underfoot, echoing like miniature explosions, and you feel tiny, almost childlike, facing the indifference of winter. Fringe stories say that some villagers even slept with small animals tucked into their beds, not just for warmth, but because superstition claimed animals could absorb frost spirits. You smile at the absurdity, then shiver, realizing survival wasn't just about logic. It was about belief, community, and a touch of stubborn madness. The sun rises slowly, a pale smear of pink behind jagged rooftops. Your breath mingles with the smoke from dozens of chimneys, each a tiny effort against a merciless season. You trudge along, noticing the subtle details, the thin layers of ice clinging to fence posts, the distant echo of axes chopping frozen wood, the occasional flicker of a candle visible through frosted windows. You can almost feel the rhythm of the village. Each motion, each task, a carefully orchestrated dance to resist the cold. And as you walk, you realize this is only the beginning. This world is harsh, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving. The moment you push open the door of a village home, you're greeted by a smell that's simultaneously comforting and faintly alarming. Damp straw mixed with smoke and a hint of clay. You step carefully over uneven floorboards, mindful of gaps that the builders never quite managed to seal. Every wall is a patchwork of stone, mud, and straw, a Frankenstein approach to insulation that somehow works. Historians still argue whether such composite walls actually held heat efficiently, or if they merely slowed the inevitable chill from creeping in. You can see the logic. Thick walls trap whatever little warmth you generate, while straw stuffed in crevices keeps the wind from sneaking through. You brush your hand along the rough surface of a wall, feeling the cold seep into your sleeve, and you wonder how anyone could stay warm here for months on end. The floor is uneven, layered with mats and dried reeds to soften the sting of frost below, and fringe sources claim that in some northern villages, people even lined their floors with moss or seaweed to trap heat. You shake your head at the mental image of moss beneath your toes, but secretly appreciate the ingenuity. Every small adaptation feels like a tiny victory against a season that doesn't negotiate. A low ceiling forces you to hunch slightly, and you notice the tiny windows barely letting in light. Glazing is thin, sometimes just oiled parchment instead of glass, distorting the view of the outside world. The chill leaks in relentlessly, but the layout of the house concentrates heat near the hearth, and you feel the logic behind centuries of trial and error. Historians still argue whether these architectural choices were conscious survival strategies or simply the result of available materials and local tradition. Either way, it's fascinating to imagine families huddled near these hearths, every movement deliberate, every blanket a lifeline. You wander over to a corner where firewood is stacked meticulously. Some logs are split, others left whole, and there's an almost ritualistic care in their arrangement. Fringe accounts suggest that villagers occasionally reserved certain logs for emergency nights, when the frost seemed determined to creep indoors, and you can't help but imagine the drama of deciding which branch was worthy of such importance. You pick up a splintered piece and weigh in your hand, feeling the potential of stored warmth. And it's both comforting and humbling. The smoke from the central hearth curls lazily, struggling to reach the ceiling before dissipating. You notice families have hung dried herbs, perhaps to scent the room, perhaps for their perceived protective qualities. Fringe stories claim that in some regions, certain herbs were thought to trap heat itself, a notion that makes you grin even as your fingers stiffen from cold. Historians still argue whether these practices were functional or purely symbolic, but you like to imagine that even a little belief in the magic of warmth could make the night more bearable. Looking around, you spot sleeping areas separated by curtains of woven fabric. Every inch of wall is functional. Hooks for clothes, shelves for food, and corners dedicated to small animals that double as heaters. Fringe accounts say some villages even had cats assigned to specific beds to maximize heat, and you stifle a laugh imagining a cat on duty like a furry, judgmental thermostat. The practical and the quirky coexist here seamlessly, a testament to human creativity under duress. As you step closer to the hearth, you notice subtle signs of maintenance. Charred ashes are carefully swept into piles, embers stored in pots for quick reignition. You think about how, without proper fire management, a night could turn into a nightmare. Historians still argue whether households relied more on continuous fires or periodic stoking to maintain livable temperatures. But you imagine each family had their own rhythm, a blend of intuition and learned habit honed over generations. Outside, the wind rattles the stone walls, a reminder that the shelter is only part of the equation. You tug your coat tighter, realizing that insulation is as much about clever human decisions as it is about materials. Straw, mud, stone, they're all part of a survival toolkit. But it's the way people layered, arranged, and treated these materials that made the difference between enduring the night and succumbing to frost. Fringe evidence hints at some villages even reused old thatch from abandoned homes, a practice both resourceful and slightly eerie, and you can't help but wonder if ghosts of past winters lingered in the fibers. You glance toward the hearth one more time, imagining families seated in close arcs, the flames reflecting on their faces, hands extended to absorb heat, stories murmured in low tones. The room is cramped, but every wall, every patch of straw, every carved stone contributes to a fragile fortress against the cold. Historians still argue whether these primitive homes were sustainable long-term or just tolerated winter out of necessity. But you sense that resilience is the key. Human beings finding ways to survive, adapt, and even find comfort, however modest, amid relentless frost. You shrug off your coat and reach for a pile of animal pelts stacked near the hearth. And suddenly warmth seems possible, if only in layers. You drape a thick bear hide over your shoulders, the coarse fur prickling your neck, and underneath you layer sheepskin, rabbit, and a patchy fox pelt that smells faintly of the wild. Historians still argue whether this method of layering different furs was purely practical or influenced by status and ritual. But right now, practicality is your only concern. You feel like a mobile, shivering quilt, each layer a small triumph against the creeping cold. As you adjust the furs, you notice a small, almost whimsical detail, a leather hood lined with goose feathers, fashioned to trap the heat around your head. Fringe tales insist that in some northern regions, people even slept in the skins of recently hunted animals, believing the warmth of the flesh transferred to the sleeper. You shiver at the mental image, imagining that it might be uncomfortable if you were squeamish or allergic, but undeniably effective. The mix of human ingenuity and sheer desperation is oddly comforting. There's humor in the extremity, a subtle wink from history at your modern pampering. You move through the room, noticing others donning their furs with a blend of ritual and urgency. Children wrestle with oversized sleeves, laughing through red cheeks, while elders adjust belts and ties to trap heat along the torso. Fringe records hint that some warriors maintained pelts strategically during winter campaigns, layering in specific sequences to maximize mobility and warmth. Historians still argue whether such practices were widely adopted or limited to elite groups. But watching the layering process in these cottages, it's clear humans have long been experimenting with thermal efficiency in their own bodies. You pause to admire a hat made from a wolf's pelt, ears dangling comically, almost like a medieval cosplay accessory. Fringe sources even claim that some villagers believe the spirit of the animal offered protection from frostbite or illness, a charming blend of superstition and practical warmth. You tug it onto your head, the fur tickling your cheeks, and can't help but laugh at the absurdity. Yet as ridiculous as it feels, every fiber of animal hair plays a role, insulating, shielding, and reminding you that survival sometimes relies on alliances with the natural world. Hands tucked into fur mittens, you experiment with movement, realizing that mobility is essential. Layers that are too tight restrict circulation, but loose ones allow chilling drafts. You notice small belts sewn across certain furs, sometimes just decorative, sometimes calculated for compression and heat retention. Historians still argue whether medieval tailors and hunters refined these techniques empirically or stumbled upon them through trial and error, but your trial run confirms that layering isn't just clothing. It's a survival system, a thermal engineering marvel cobbled together from instinct and observation. You wander toward a corner where scraps of hides are stored. Oddities abound. Raccoon masks, beaver tails sewn as skirts, even tiny rabbit pelts repurposed into foot coverings. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers believe that wearing animal extremities help preserve the warmth of your own, a bizarre but endearing superstition. You tug a small fur onto your foot and feel immediately less exposed to the icy stone beneath you. There's something profoundly human in this mix of practicality and belief, a recognition that cold survival is both physical and psychological. You notice a small fire pit and the shadows dancing across the walls, bringing the furs to life in soft, flickering patterns. The room smells faintly of smoke and animal musk, a combination that would make your modern nose wrinkle but signals safety and warmth here. You think of hunters returning from snowy forests, sleds laden with pelts, each one a bundle of hope for their family survival. Historians still argue whether the reliance on animal pelts led to significant ecological impacts or if populations were surprisingly resilient, but you can't deny the immediate effectiveness in a pinch, where the beast become temporarily impervious to the cold. As the day lengthens outside, the frost glinting in the low sun, you notice that layering extends beyond utility. Decorative stitching, subtle color patches, and braided fur trim suggest a cultural dimension. Fringe researchers even posit that these winter clothes carried social or magical meanings, coded into seams and patterns. You tug at a corner of a vest, imagining that every stitch might have a story, a hidden charm against frost, boredom, or the unknown night. The cold is relentless, but human creativity, expressed in every hide, fur, and stitch, offers a small, enduring resistance. By the time you settle near the hearth, wrapped in a motley of pelts, the world outside feels both distant and brutal. You imagine villagers moving through blizzards in similar ensembles, their bodies warm, their spirits bolstered by ingenuity and belief alike. Fringe sources even describe nocturnal heat rituals, where people would huddle under layered furs to summon or honor winter spirits. Historians still argue whether these were ceremonial or strictly pragmatic, but there's no question that the combination of furs, strategy, and a little superstition shaped winter survival in ways both practical and profoundly human. You lean back, letting the warmth seep through and realize the lesson. Survival isn't just about enduring cold. It's about mastering layers, trusting instinct, and sometimes believing that the spirit of a wolf or bear can literally shield you from frost. And as you sink deeper into the pile, you feel that ancient ingenuity, bizarre habits, and human stubbornness converging into a single, flickering heartbeat of warmth. You notice the small cottage isn't just a shelter, it's a social furnace. The central hearth roars, or more accurately, sputters, casting a circle of warmth that everyone seems magnetically drawn to. You step closer, instinctively arranging yourself between two villagers who are barely acknowledging your presence, but clearly desperate for every centimeter of shared heat. Communal strategies were essential. Historians still argue whether such arrangements arose from necessity or early social planning. But you can feel it now. Warmth as currency, friendship, and survival all wrapped into one flickering flame. You observe the ritualistic seating around the hearth. Elders sit closer to the center, likely for authority as much as heat, while younger members occupy the outer edges. Fringe records even suggest that in some northern European villages, seating order around the fire was almost ceremonial, a combination of status and thermal efficiency. You can't help but smile at the absurdity. A medieval version of musical chairs with frostbite lurking in the corners. Yet as comical as it sounds, the arrangement makes sense. Close proximity preserves life when the cold outside bites as fiercely as a wolf. Children cluster together, giggling and shoving each other as they attempt to stay warm. You notice a tiny, shivering dog tucked into a corner. Someone drapes an extra scarf around its body. Fringe accounts hint that pets weren't just companions. They were integral parts of the human heat economy, their tiny bodies supplementing what the fire couldn't provide. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or an anecdotal quirk, but seeing the animal huddle makes you reconsider the term pack survival. It's not just human bodies against the cold. It's every living being contributing. Nearby, someone stirs a cauldron with a long-handled spoon, the scent of stew mingling with smoke. You realize the fire serves multiple roles: cooking, light, and warmth. Fringe evidence even suggests that some medieval kitchens had rotating schedules to ensure no one sat too long near the flames, preventing anyone from monopolizing heat. You raise an eyebrow, imagining the petty arguments that must have erupted over hot spots, and a small laugh escapes your lips despite your own chilled fingers. Historians still argue whether these communal fire routines were regulated socially or just emerged organically from sheer desperation. You notice how bodies cluster in subtle, almost instinctive patterns. Shoulder to shoulder, back to back, the villagers exchange heat as easily as conversation. Fringe tales claim that some cultures even developed heat circles, where people would rotate positions during the night to ensure everyone remained alive. You imagine a sleepy game of thermal musical chairs unfolding in the darkness, and it makes the idea of surviving frost seem almost fun, if you ignore the gnawing fear of being on the outer edge. You walk toward the hearth and notice how objects themselves are part of the communal strategy. Stones are strategically placed to radiate residual warmth. Small clay ovens are stacked to hold embers. Even benches and mats are oriented to maximize contact with heat pockets. Historians still argue whether early households consciously engineered these heat zones, or if they were simply learned through trial and error, but you can see the pattern. Life and survival in winter were all about understanding microclimates inside a room. Someone hands you a mug of lukewarm broth, a mix of grains and root vegetables, and you sip carefully, savoring the modest heat. Fringe accounts suggest that certain spices were added less for flavor and more for their warming properties, a combination of physiology and folklore. You consider the possibility that belief in heat-enhancing herbs may have been as important as the calories themselves, a mental nudge to endure the relentless cold. The shared sip feels intimate, a minor ceremony of survival repeated countless times over centuries. Across the room, laughter erupts as someone's mitten catches fire from stray spark. You cringe, imagining frostbite as punishment for clumsiness, but quickly realize that the humor itself is survival, lightening the psychological burden of endless cold. Historians still argue whether humor and camaraderie were critical components of communal winter survival or incidental byproducts. But it's clear that laughter is another kind of warmth. You glance outside the window at the snow-laden street, the wind whipping loose flakes in dizzying swirls. You realize how critical it was to share warmth indoors because stepping outside meant trading comfort for necessity. Fringe evidence hints that in some regions, entire villages maintained rotating watch shifts, so no one froze while gathering fuel. You imagine villagers coordinating like a well-rehearsed ballet against frost and darkness. The children start a quiet game of whispered storytelling, leaning into each other's warmth. You catch fragments of myths, some involving frost spirits, others heroic hunts, and even a few completely absurd tales where snow itself had consciousness. Historians still argue whether these narratives were purely entertainment or a subtle way to instruct survival skills. But the effect is tangible. Shared stories, laughter, and strategic closeness create a bubble of warmth against the cold reality pressing in from all sides. You stretch your fingers toward the fire, feeling the heat licking at your skin, and understand that this communal strategy isn't just about bodies. It's about coordination, trust, and small acts repeated night after night. Fringe sources suggest that in some Scandinavian villages, people would even link hands across households to transmit warmth, a kind of network survival. You imagine a living, breathing human heater stretching across streets, a comforting yet slightly absurd thought. By the time evening descends and shadows stretch across the walls, you feel the subtle rhythm of life here. Bodies moving, fires maintained, broth sipped, stories shared. The cold outside is merciless, but inside, it's almost tolerable. Historians still argue whether such communal heat practices were widespread or localized. But what's undeniable is the ingenuity, a mixture of warmth, whimsy, and sheer human stubbornness keeping the frost at bay. And as you settle into a cluster of villagers near the hearth, shoulder pressed against shoulder, you realize that survival isn't solitary, it's shared. Every laugh, every shifting of a blanket, every careful rotation of hands and feet contributes to a small, flickering network of heat that makes life in winter not just possible, but faintly bearable. You step outside, lungs filling with the icy bite of winter, and immediately notice how vital firewood has become. Every villager is a small army of scavengers, lugging chopped logs, branches, and discarded pieces of timber. Historians still argue whether early societies viewed firewood as communal property or fiercely guarded private resources. But watching the scramble, it's clear that warmth depends on fuel as much as skill or courage. You trudge along icy paths, dodging drifts and slipping on patches of black ice. Each step a reminder that frost waits for no one. Branches crack underfoot as you navigate the forest's edge, the skeletal trees swaying and whispering in the wind. Fringe accounts claim that in desperate times, villagers would pilfer wood from abandoned graves or even rival settlements. You grimace at the thought, imagining a nighttime stealth mission under frost-glazed moonlight, perhaps punctuated by frantic whispers and over-enthusiastic crunching of snow. Historians still argue whether these stories were common or exaggerated morality tales, but they highlight a harsh truth. Firewood was survival currency, and scarcity could ignite tension. You notice some villagers carrying bundles of moss and dried reeds alongside logs. Fringe evidence suggests that moss was sometimes used as kindling, insulation, or even fire accelerant, while scholars debate whether such techniques were regional innovation or trial-and-error survival hacks. You pause to inspect a bundle, letting the texture tickle your fingers and shiver despite the mild friction-generated warmth. Nature provided both challenge and solution, and it was up to humans to improvise, innovate, and occasionally steal what they needed. The small settlements you pass are tense, quiet except for the occasional distant shout or bark of a dog. You overhear whispers about a neighbor allegedly hoarding wood, sparking murmurs of outrage and hints of clandestine firewood raids. Fringe accounts claim these raids sometimes escalated into snowball battles or minor skirmishes, small-scale civil wars over warmth. Historians still argue whether these incidents were widespread or isolated anecdotes, but you can't help but feel a thrill imagining the high stakes of frozen resource management. You trudge up a narrow incline, bundles of branches digging into your arms, when you notice the ingenuity of fuel stacking. Piles are arranged meticulously to dry without losing warmth, ensuring maximum burn efficiency. Fringe records even suggest that in certain regions, logs were placed near communal paths to preheat before use. A bizarre but practical step. You adjust your grip on your load and think about how meticulous, mundane planning was as crucial as courage or brute strength in surviving winter. Your fingers ache from cold, and you realize how much energy these tasks consume. The body's own heat becomes a tool and a commodity. Fringe evidence claims some villages had firewood rotations, schedules to prevent overexertion while gathering fuel. Historians still argue whether such systems were formalized or casual, but the concept makes sense. The body is both machine and heater, and overworking it can be fatal. You marvel at the complexity of human adaptation. Every movement a calculation in calories, warmth, and endurance. A thin layer of snow blankets the ground, crunching beneath your boots. You glimpse tracks, children, dogs, or neighbors. Fringe accounts sometimes attribute unusual shapes in the snow to frost spirits warning against reckless wood gathering, a charming superstition layered over practical survival. Historians still argue whether such beliefs genuinely influenced behavior or merely added narrative flair to hardship, but you find the idea comforting, imagining invisible guides helping you carry your bundle safely. At a distant copse, you spot a small, frozen pond being used as an impromptu wood-drying area. Logs are stacked carefully along the edges, their tops slightly raised to prevent snow accumulation. Fringe tales claim that in some villages, women and children would patrol these drying racks at night, guarding them from frost or thieves. Historians still argue whether gender roles were strictly adhered to or more fluid, but you can see the underlying logic. Protecting your fuel is as important as procuring it. By late afternoon, your arms are sore, fingers numb, and breath fogs and puffs. The village stockpiles look surprisingly organized, each bundle tagged with a crude tally mark or family symbol. Fringe sources hint that marking what ownership was sometimes ritualistic, believed to protect the logs from being claimed by frost spirits. Historians still argue whether these markings were functional or superstitious, but the system feels smart. If nothing else, it prevents disputes over who gets the next log for the hearth. Returning to the hearth, you notice the quiet satisfaction in villagers' faces as the fire crackles to life, logs stacked precisely for maximum burn. You sip a lukewarm broth, fingers still tingling, and reflect on the immense effort needed just to maintain basic warmth. Fringe evidence suggests that in some regions, entire nights were spent in rotation, tending fires so that no ember died. Historians still argue whether such vigilance was routine or exceptional, but the lesson is clear. Firewood was not just material. It was the foundation of winter survival, and managing it demanded skill, strategy, and sometimes a little audacity. The wind rattles the windows outside, a harsh reminder that the cold never rests. You stretch near the hearth, feeling the contrast between effort spent gathering fuel and the cozy reward of warmth. Fringe tales suggest that some villagers even slept in shifts near fires to preserve embers, almost as if guarding warmth itself. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or localized, but you sense a truth. In a winter without modern heating, life revolves around the careful orchestration of fire, human labor, and sheer stubbornness. As darkness settles, you watch the firelight flicker across faces, bodies pressed close together, and logs burning slowly. Every bundle of wood represents hours of effort, a tangible measure of survival. Fringe accounts claim that in particularly brutal winters, a single stolen log could be a matter of life and death, turning neighbors into allies or rivals. Historians still argue whether tales of wood theft were hyperbolic or common reality, but the importance of fuel in winter is undeniable. You realize that surviving frost isn't heroic in dramatic gestures. It's in the daily, tireless attention to what keeps you warm. You sit back, feeling the heat radiate from the fire in your labor, and for a moment, you understand the delicate balance. Every piece of wood, every ember, every careful rotation of logs contributes to a fragile, flickering bubble of survival in an indifferent winter. And as the cold presses at the edges of the cottage, you appreciate the blend of ingenuity, community, and stubborn human spirit that turns raw timber into the most vital treasure imaginable: warmth. You curl up near the hearth, the heat seeping into your chilled bones, and start noticing the most intimate and peculiar method of survival: the use of human body heat. You observe how villagers huddle in shifts on straw-stuffed beds, layering themselves in blankets and furs to maximize warmth. Fringe sources suggest that in some medieval towns, families rotated sleeping positions nightly, moving the youngest or weakest members closer to the hearth or next to stronger, warmer adults. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were strictly practical or ritualized, but either way, it's ingenious. You tuck your chin into your chest, imagining a pile of people functioning almost like a living radiator, their collective warmth holding the cold at bay. You notice children burrowing between adults, their small bodies radiating disproportionate amounts of heat. Fringe accounts claim that some communities even had specialized human heating guilds, where volunteers slept together in designated spaces to provide warmth for the sick or elderly. Historians still argue whether these guilds truly existed or are exaggerated tales, but the idea captures the human impulse. When heat is scarce, bodies become a form of currency. You adjust your position, pressing closer to others, feeling a combination of comfort, absurdity, and survival logic converge. The rhythmic exhalation of breath fills the room, a visible mist curling in the cold corners, reminding you that each body contributes more than just warmth. It generates humidity that keeps the air from becoming brittle and painful. Fringe sources suggest that in some villages, villagers would even intentionally sleep head to foot to ensure that warmth circulated efficiently, a primitive but remarkably effective approach to thermodynamics. Historians still argue whether these patterns were conscious or developed through trial and error, but the results speak for themselves. It works. You stretch, noticing how muscle tension and movement can generate additional heat. Some fringe accounts hint that villagers practice subtle, almost imperceptible exercises under blankets, like tensing muscles or gentle shifting, to keep blood flowing and bodies warm. Historians still argue whether such practices were routine or occasional, but you try it anyway, feeling the small warmth radiate from your own arms and legs. You realize the human body is not just a passive vessel in winter. It's an active participant in survival. Each heartbeat and muscle twitch a tiny contribution to collective endurance. You glance at a small child, bundled in rabbit pelts, and notice how even minimal contact multiplies warmth. Fringe tales claim that in certain northern settlements, people would sleep in piles arranged by age or size to optimize heat retention, almost like a primitive algorithm for thermal efficiency. Historians still argue whether these sleeping arrangements were strictly necessary or a cultural preference, but you can't deny the logic. Proximity and pressure make cold more manageable. A quiet conversation unfolds between two adults about who should sleep near the weak or ill. You realize this is more than convenience. It's strategic placement. Fringe accounts suggest that in some villages, children slept with animals for additional warmth. The small bodies of cats or dogs pressed to bare skin to supplement the human contribution. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or isolated anecdotes, but you find yourself nodding, acknowledging that ingenuity often borders on eccentricity in the fight for survival. You notice how the smallest gestures, tucking an arm around a neighbor, adjusting blankets, swapping positions, make tangible differences in warmth. Fringe evidence even hints at elaborate nighttime routines, where families rotated who would sleep closest to the fire and who would absorb residual heat from others, almost like a choreography of survival. Historians still argue whether such rituals were functional or ceremonial, but the effect is undeniable. A coordinated network of bodies, blankets, and hearth warmth, each element reinforcing the other. As the night deepens, you start feeling the strange intimacy of this method. It's both awkward and profoundly human, pressing shoulders, sharing body heat, silently negotiating proximity and comfort. Fringe accounts even suggest that some communities kept detailed oral records of successful heat-sharing strategies, teaching younger generations the optimal way to arrange themselves in winter beds. Historians still argue whether such oral traditions existed universally or only in select regions. But the idea strikes you as both bizarre and practical. You notice subtle details. The way toes tuck against the edge of a blanket, the rhythmic inhalation of breath in sync with neighbors, even the occasional shivering that signals rotation or movement. Fringe sources claim that some groups developed code words to signal when a heat shift was needed, minimizing disruption. Historians still argue whether these practices were common or anecdotal, but imagining whispered instructions in the cold night adds a layer of humanity to the survival narrative. You try to imagine the winter nights outside this small cluster of bodies, the frost relentless, the cold unforgiving. Every huddle, every layer of fur or blanket, every shift of shoulder or foot contributes to a fragile system of survival. Fringe accounts hint that some of these arrangements even had ritualized elements, quiet prayers, blessings, or superstitions, designed to anchor warmth, blending practicality with belief. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuinely effective or symbolic, but in the moment, it all feels crucial. By the time you start to relax, you notice the interplay of trust and strategy. Sleeping too far from the hearth or weak bodies means vulnerability. Too close risks discomfort or accidental smothering. Fringe sources suggest some families even had designated warmth officers to oversee these nightly rotations. Historians still argue whether such roles were formalized or informal, but the coordination is clear. Survival requires constant, careful management of human resources. You tuck your head into the nest of furs and blankets, feeling the cumulative heat of human ingenuity, absurdity, and instinct. The small, breathing network of bodies around you transforms the bitter winter night into something almost livable, if still uncomfortable. You understand suddenly that the fight against cold isn't waged by firewood alone. It's waged by every heartbeat, every small motion, and every calculated cuddle in the relentless frost. You sip a mug of steaming broth, the liquid thick with grains and a hint of animal fat, and realize that survival isn't just about heat. It's also about what you put in your stomach. The calories are your internal furnace, every spoonful fueling warmth from within. Fringe accounts claim that some medieval villagers drank herbal teas designed more for their warming essence than flavor, and historians still argue whether these concoctions genuinely raised body temperature or merely offered psychological comfort. Either way, you feel the heat creeping back into your fingers, a reminder that nutrition is a silent partner in winter survival. You reach for a small piece of preserved meat, tasting the salt and fat that somehow makes the chill easier to bear. You remember that high-fat diets were prized in some northern communities, dense calories providing insulation against the relentless cold. Fringe evidence even suggests that people sometimes added small amounts of snow to hot drinks, claiming it tempered the warmth and allowed them to sip slowly without burning their mouths. Historians still argue whether such practices were common or eccentric habits, but you try it anyway, finding a strange satisfaction in the absurdity. Your eyes wander around the room and notice a kettle suspended over the fire. Steam curls upward, carrying the faint scent of roots, dried herbs, and a hint of charred wood. Fringe accounts suggest that some households kept multiple small fires just to ensure a constant supply of warm liquids, a complex but effective method of heat retention. Historians still argue whether this was practical or excessive, but watching villagers rotate tasks around the hearth, you see a rhythm emerging. Fire, broth, sharing, repeat. Children poke at the edge of the stew pot, impatient for the meal to cool. Fringe tales claim that in some villages, special warming spices were traded like currency, considered as crucial to survival as wood or furs. You sprinkle a little dried herb into your own mug and notice how it heightens the sense of warmth, even if the scientific effect is negligible. Historians still argue whether these spices genuinely improved thermal comfort or served as a comforting placebo, but the psychological boost is undeniable. You notice how meals themselves become strategic tools against frost. Villagers eat small portions frequently, keeping metabolism active, while others rely on large, dense meals to generate extended warmth. Fringe evidence hints that some communities even prepared broths in layers, alternating ingredients based on caloric density and warming potential. Historians still argue whether such culinary methods were standard practice or experimental, but it's clear that winter food is less about taste and more about survival calculus. You reach for a small slice of hard bread, dry and dense, yet perfect for chewing near the fire. Fringe records claim that some households kept special emergency rations, little bundles of high-calorie foods reserved for nights when the frost threatened to invade the hearth. Historians still argue whether these emergency foods were widely used or anecdotal, but imagining their existence gives a sense of both ingenuity and foresight. Every crumb becomes a calculated boost against the biting cold. You notice the gestures around the table, subtle exchanges of morsels, shared sips from a single mug, and careful rationing of warmth through hot foods. Fringe accounts suggest that in some communities, ritualistic toasting was performed before drinking, invoking luck or blessings for continued warmth. Historians still argue whether these were widespread practices or isolated superstitions, but participating, even silently, creates a shared rhythm that reinforces both social bonds and physical survival. As you stir the stew absent-mindedly, you notice the color of the broth shifting in the firelight, a warm amber against the gray chill seeping through the walls. Fringe evidence claims that some spices were chosen not for flavor, but for their color, believed to psychologically enhance warmth. Historians still argue whether this effect was intentional or coincidental, but you can't deny the comforting visual impact. Sometimes warmth is as much about perception as it is about thermodynamics. You glance around the room and see neighbors nibbling on roots, small cuts of preserved meat, and even hand-sized morsels of dried fruit. Fringe accounts suggest that in some harsh winters, villagers would chew pine needles or spruce tips for both nutrition and a sense of internal heat, a practice that sounds bizarre yet fascinating. Historians still argue whether this was health-motivated or superstition, but the ingenuity of using everything available for survival is clear. You take a slow breath and realize that warmth isn't just external. It's chemical, metabolic, and social. Every sip, every bite, every carefully rationed morsel fuels bodies that will huddle together for the night, layering heat in strategies passed down through generations. Fringe tales claim that some households kept tiny pots of broth simmering all night, a combination of thermal maintenance and psychological comfort. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or exceptional, but you can feel the logic. Heat, sustenance, and morale are inextricably linked. By the time evening deepens, you notice subtle choreography. Some villagers stirring stews, others rotating firewood, children nibbling quietly, and elders sipping slowly to prolong heat. Fringe sources claim that the process of eating itself was ritualized to conserve warmth, balancing metabolic demands with the need to remain near the fire. Historians still argue whether these routines were practical, ceremonial, or a blend of both, but it's evident that nourishment is survival, and sometimes a small comfort that carries you through endless winter nights. Finally, as you lean back and let the warmth of broth and body heat seep in, you notice the profound interconnection between food, fire, and human ingenuity. Every sip fuels metabolism, every bite preserves energy, and every shared moment strengthens the collective ability to endure. Fringe accounts hint that survival in winter was as much about maintaining morale through meals as it was about insulation or hearth placement. Historians still argue the exact weight of each factor, but one thing is clear. In a world without heating, food and warmth are inseparable allies, sustaining both body and spirit. You squint at the flickering light cast by a small animal fat lamp, the smoke curling lazily toward the low ceiling. It's barely enough to illuminate the room, but in winter darkness, it feels like a miracle. Fringe sources suggest that some households used wicks made of twisted cloth or even moss, believing certain materials burned warmer or longer. Historians still argue whether these innovations were truly functional or simply experimental, but you can't deny the charm of their inventiveness. Each tiny flame becomes more than light. It's a lifeline, a guardian against the endless night pressing in from outside. You notice how people cluster closer to these little lamps, hands stretched toward the feeble glow. Shadow plays on stone walls, dancing and flickering, giving even the coldest corners the illusion of life. Fringe tales suggest that some villagers performed small rituals around these lights, whispering words meant to trap warmth or ward off frost spirits. Historians still argue whether these were widespread superstitions or isolated eccentricities, but the effect is tangible. Warmth isn't just physical, it's psychological, ritualized, and very human. You lean closer to a lamp, fascinated by its uneven flame, and realize that light itself generates heat, however slight. Some fringe accounts claim that multiple small lamps placed strategically around a room created a thermal microclimate, preventing cold drafts from settling. Historians still argue whether early households consciously applied this knowledge or stumbled upon it, but you notice subtle patterns. Lamps near sleeping areas, along hallways, and close to cooking pots, each position enhancing comfort in small ways. You watch a small child poke at a lamp with a stick, giggling at the dancing shadows. Fringe evidence claims that in some communities, children were trained to adjust wicks or oil levels as part of early thermal education. Historians still argue whether these practices were genuinely widespread or fanciful, but the image is charming. Kids learning the intricate art of light and warmth through playful engagement. You tuck your hands closer to your body, marveling at the blend of responsibility and amusement. Across the room, a woman carefully trims a wick with scissors, her fingers nimble despite the cold. Fringe accounts suggest that some households used scented fats, like tallow mixed with herbs, not just for light, but to create a warm ambience, a subtle psychological boost during months when sunlight barely touches the village. Historians still argue whether such practices were practical or symbolic, but you can sense their value. Even a faint scent, paired with flickering light, makes the cold less oppressive. You notice small clusters of lamps arranged on shelves and windowsills, creating pockets of warmth and light. Fringe records indicate that in some northern settlements, villagers developed miniature light grids, a way to maintain a sense of orientation and comfort in the darkness. Historians still argue whether these grids were systematic or ad hoc, but they clearly show that survival extended beyond firewood and clothing. It involved manipulating light and shadow to create psychologically bearable spaces. A tiny flicker from a lamp illuminates a corner where herbs hang from the ceiling, drying. Fringe evidence suggests that some households believe that certain scents could summon heat or repel frost spirits. Historians still argue whether these were superstition or early attempts at aromatherapy, but you breathe in the faint mix of dried rosemary and pine, feeling inexplicably warmer. There's a tactile, almost magical quality to survival here. It's not just temperature, it's smell, sight, and ritual all working together. You notice the contrast between lamp light and firelight. The hearth dominates, of course, but lamps fill the periphery, creating a network of modest comfort. Fringe tales suggest that villagers rotated which lamps were lit each night to conserve fat or tallow, balancing warmth with resource management. Historians still argue whether this system was widespread or anecdotal, but you can see the logic: heat, light, and conservation intertwined, each element supporting life in winter's harsh grasp. The shadows cast by the lamp flicker across furs and blankets, accentuating textures and colors. Fringe accounts claim that people sometimes position mirrors or polished metal to reflect light, doubling both illumination and perceived warmth. Historians still argue whether such reflections were functional or symbolic, but the subtle glow gives the room a softness, a sense that even in the cold, ingenuity could make life tolerable. You notice a small group of villagers huddled near a lamp on the floor, hands cupped around it, faces glowing with its tiny heat. Fringe tales hint that some communities use these portable lights to warm small personal spaces, a practice you imagine as a medieval version of a space heater. Historians still argue whether this was practical on a large scale, but in this intimate cluster, it works perfectly. Warmth, light, and companionship compressed into a few square feet. You lean back, watching the interplay of shadows, flickers, and faces. Every lamp, every small ember, every flicker of flame becomes a node in a larger survival network. Fringe sources suggest that in extreme cases, households lit dozens of small lamps to combat the psychological effects of darkness, supplementing heat and morale simultaneously. Historians still argue whether this strategy was ritualistic, pragmatic, or both, but you sense a rhythm, a living pulse that connects human ingenuity to the relentless winter outside. The wind rattles the walls, a persistent reminder of what's beyond, but inside, the network of lamps and fires creates a fragile sanctuary. Fringe tales suggest that some villagers even used reflective surfaces to spread light into dark corners, attempting to extend warmth. Historians still argue whether these were true early experiments in physics or just clever storytelling, but the idea resonates. Survival is as much about cleverness as it is about endurance. Finally, as you settle near a cluster of lamps, the soft flickering glow washes over faces, furs, and walls, a subtle, comforting rhythm. Fringe accounts hint that people sometimes whispered to the flames, small superstitions or rituals meant to coax warmth from the wax or tallow. Historians still argue whether this was practical or purely symbolic, but for you, the effect is immediate. Even a small, humble light feels like a bastion against winter's relentless darkness. You push back from the hearth and start pacing around the room, realizing that stillness makes the cold creep into your bones faster than anything else. Movement is essential, even indoors. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers practiced subtle hearth exercises, light stretches, or shadow dances, designed to keep circulation active without leaving the shelter. Historians still argue whether these routines were widespread or mostly anecdotal, but watching villagers shuffle, twist, and squat near the fire, you understand the logic. Motion generates heat, and heat saves lives. You begin mimicking a few of the movements, bending knees and swinging arms, feeling warmth bloom slowly from your extremities. Children jump and stomp in place, creating a tiny percussion against the frost-hardened floor. Fringe sources suggest that some communities even held playful competitions, hopping or shuffling to see who could stay warm the longest. Historians still argue whether these were purely survival practices or early forms of entertainment, but the joy in movement is obvious, a small rebellion against winter's oppression. You notice a small group performing what looks like a snowshoe shadow dance. Their silhouettes stretch and contort in the firelight, the rhythm both chaotic and oddly graceful. Fringe accounts suggest that some rituals like this serve dual purposes, warming bodies and keeping spirits alive. Historians still argue whether these were inherited traditions or improvised exercises, but either way, you can see that movement isn't just functional. It's deeply human, a blend of art, play, and survival instinct. Your breath fogs the cold air as you shuffle across the floor, your muscles awakening, circulation improving. Fringe tales hint that in some northern villages, older adults would demonstrate slow, controlled stretches to prevent stiffness and frostbite. Historians still argue whether these practices were learned empirically or through cultural transmission, but you feel the wisdom. Motion and heat are inseparable in winter survival. You notice the children imitating adults, small legs hopping, tiny arms swinging. Fringe sources suggest that this early physical training ensured that the young could endure harsh winters without injury. Historians still argue whether such exercises were intentional pedagogy or simply play disguised as necessity. But the scene before you is delightful. Survival lessons woven seamlessly into everyday life. You glance at a corner where a family is performing a coordinated series of gentle squats and lunges near the fire, careful not to displace the embers. Fringe records claim that in some communities, such indoor exercises were scheduled around meal times to maximize energy use and heat generation. Historians still argue whether these schedules were formal or fluid, but you notice the efficiency. The human body itself is a furnace, and choreographing movement can optimize warmth. Your fingers tingle as blood pumps through them, and you realize that even small, repetitive gestures, shuffling feet, clapping hands, rolling shoulders, contribute significantly to retaining body heat. Fringe accounts hint that some villages developed intricate indoor routines during blizzards, almost like a dance curriculum designed for warmth rather than aesthetics. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or exceptional, but the underlying principle is simple. Staying warm requires motion, creativity, and awareness. You pause near the hearth to stretch, noting how different body positions preserve or release heat. Fringe sources suggest that subtle shifts, crossing legs, curling into a ball, pressing against a neighbor, were taught through observation and imitation. Historians still argue whether these methods were instinctive or formalized, but they clearly enhance survival chances. You roll your shoulders and laugh quietly, imagining someone centuries ago inventing thermal yoga out of necessity. The rhythmic motion of the villagers generates more than warmth, it fosters camaraderie. Fringe accounts describe small indoor games and competitions designed to keep both spirits and bodies active during the longest nights. Historians still argue whether these were recreational or strictly utilitarian, but the laughter, playful shoving, and shared effort indicate that joy itself may have been a survival tool. You notice subtle strategies, pairing smaller bodies with larger ones for maximum heat, pacing in circles to prevent drafts, or bouncing lightly on toes to maintain circulation. Fringe tales claim that some northern communities even devised coordinated human exercise shifts during winter nights, a combination of physical training and heat preservation. Historians still argue whether these were widespread innovations or rare anecdotes, but the logic is clear. Movement plus coordination equals survival. By evening, the room hums with activity, low conversations blending with movement and laughter. The children tire first, curling near the hearth. Adults continue gently pacing and stretching. Fringe sources suggest that this balance of rest and motion was observed carefully to prevent frostbite or muscle strain. Historians still argue whether these routines were rigidly followed or flexible, but you sense the accumulated knowledge of generations encoded in these gestures. You take a slow breath, muscles warmed, blood flowing, and realize the interplay. Body heat, coordinated movement, and shared effort all weave together into a resilient system. Fringe evidence hints that such indoor exercises were as much about mental endurance as physical, a way to prevent despair during long, unrelenting winters. Historians still argue whether the psychological benefits were intentional or incidental, but you feel it. Motion, laughter, and strategy combine into a living firewall against cold. Finally, as the fire crackles and shadows flicker, you lean against a neighbor, letting residual warmth seep into you. The room moves with a quiet rhythm. Shuffle, stretch, laugh, sip broth, rotate, repeat. It's both absurd and brilliant, a choreography born not of art, but survival. And as you settle into the flow, you realize that in a winter without heating, your own body, cooperating with others, is perhaps the most reliable furnace of all. You glance outside the window and shiver at the swirling snowdrifts, realizing that the battle against winter doesn't end indoors. Villagers are still moving through the streets, carrying supplies, checking on neighbors, and making daring trips to fetch water or firewood. Fringe accounts suggest that some communities even developed relay systems, where teams would transport essentials in shifts to minimize exposure. Historians still argue whether these systems were common or only present in extreme climates. But watching the coordination, you feel the ingenuity at play. Winter survival isn't solitary. It's a networked effort. You watch a figure trudge through the snow, the weight of supplies almost obscuring their form. Fringe sources claim that in some northern regions, people would carve temporary sled tracks or compact snow paths to ease movement. Historians still argue whether these were formalized infrastructure or ad hoc solutions, but you admire the resourcefulness. Every step through the ice and snow is a small victory, each rhythm of effort a calculated defense against frostbite and fatigue. As you step outside to join them, your boots crunch sharply against frozen mud and snow. The cold bites immediately, and you wrap your arms around yourself instinctively. Fringe tales claim that people would sometimes preheat gloves or boots near fires before venturing out, a simple yet ingenious tactic to extend mobility. Historians still argue whether such precautions were routine or sporadic, but you understand the principle. Surviving the cold isn't just about reaching shelter. It's about preparing for the journey itself. You notice that paths between houses are narrow, trampled down by daily traffic, a human-created lifeline in an otherwise impenetrable landscape. Fringe evidence suggests that some communities maintain these paths meticulously, shoveling snow or reinforcing edges with brushwood. Historians still argue whether this practice was practical or ceremonial, but you recognize its value. A clear path is the difference between successful supply runs and frostbitten failure. Carrying a bundle of firewood, you spot children engaged in a playful yet practical task, rolling logs across the snow toward their home. Fringe accounts hint that such tasks doubled as exercise, teaching coordination and stamina while providing necessary warmth for families. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or incidental, but the logic is clear. Every motion has purpose in a world dictated by cold. The wind whips your face as you continue, stinging skin and frosting eyelashes. Fringe tales claim that some villagers would coat exposed skin with animal fat or lard, creating a barrier against frostbite. Historians still argue whether this was a universal practice or isolated to specific regions. But you smear a small amount across your cheeks and marvel at the primitive ingenuity. Biology plus resourcefulness equals survival. You pass a frozen stream and notice how some villagers have used ice blocks to construct temporary shelters or windbreaks. Fringe sources suggest that these ice structures could maintain slightly higher temperatures when combined with straw and animal hides. Historians still argue whether these methods were widely adopted or experimental, but the concept fascinates you, turning the cold itself into a protective tool. The village dogs pad beside their humans, moving confidently through deep snow. Fringe accounts claim that some communities relied on animals not just for companionship, but as early warning systems, detecting thin ice, predators, or unstable snowdrifts. Historians still argue whether the relationship between animals and human warmth was primarily practical or mutualistic, but you appreciate the teamwork. Survival extends beyond humans, incorporating every capable being. You pause at a crossroads where multiple households converge. Bundles of supplies are exchanged, greetings are whispered, and plans are quietly coordinated for the evening. Fringe sources suggest that some villages used subtle signals, flags, lanterns, or coded knocks to communicate across distances in snowbound silence. Historians still argue whether such systems were standardized or improvised, but the effort highlights the intelligence embedded in everyday survival networks. A sudden gust flings snow into your face, making you stumble, and you notice how villagers move in almost choreographed patterns to shield each other and minimize exposure. Fringe evidence claims that in some regions, people even created human snow walls, linking arms to protect the most vulnerable from cutting winds. Historians still argue whether these were widespread or anecdotal, but witnessing the teamwork is a reminder that warmth is as much about collaboration as insulation. You reach a neighbor's house, breath steaming in the cold, and help stack wood near the doorway. Fringe accounts suggest that households often assisted each other to ensure the village maintained a communal minimum supply, a form of collective insurance against deep freezes. Historians still argue whether this practice was driven by survival pragmatics or social cohesion, but it's clear that cold fosters cooperation. The evening darkens, and you notice lanterns flickering from other homes, tiny beacons against the white storm. Fringe sources claim that maintaining visibility was both practical, preventing missteps, and psychological, a symbol that someone, somewhere, remained warm. Historians still argue whether this was ritualistic or functional, but the effect is undeniable. A faint sense of community and reassurance in the endless cold. You trudge back to your own home, arms sore, fingers tingling from exertion, yet carrying the satisfaction of contribution. Fringe accounts hint that even small acts, like stacking firewood or clearing snow, had cascading effects on communal survival. Historians still argue whether these systems were consciously structured or emergent behaviors, but the principle resonates. Winter demands participation. Finally, you reach the warmth of the hearth, exhausted yet invigorated. The snow outside is relentless, but the fire, the layers of fur, and a collective human effort create a fragile, resilient bubble. Fringe tales suggest that even brief lapses in communal vigilance could have drastic consequences. Historians still argue whether these extreme winter strategies were necessity or tradition. But in this moment, the coordination, ingenuity, and shared labor all converge into one undeniable truth. Survival is a team effort, measured in heat, movement, and tiny acts of endurance. You sink in your layered furs and notice the small, subtle ways people preserve heat overnight. Fringe accounts suggest that some medieval families would pile straw or reeds under mattresses, insulating bodies from the frozen floor. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or a regional quirk, but it's immediately obvious. Contact with the earth is cold, and clever insulation can save lives. You shift, letting the warmth of both straw and body settle into your limbs, marveling at the simple genius of ancient survival. You notice the villagers arranging themselves carefully on the beds, head-to-foot patterns, maximizing shared warmth. Fringe sources claim that families even rotated positions during the night, preventing anyone from being too exposed to drafts or cold patches. Historians still argue whether these rotations were strict routines or spontaneous adjustments, but watching the methodical distribution of bodies, you understand the logic. Every inch, every contact, every decision counts. A child curls beside an elder, the heat radiating from their body, warming the tiny fingers of the youngest. Fringe evidence hints that in some settlements, children were deliberately placed with adults who retained more body heat, almost like thermal mentorship. Historians still argue whether this was widespread strategy or occasional improvisation, but the results are obvious. Warmth is transferable if carefully managed. You notice blankets and furs layered in a mosaic of textures and patterns. Fringe accounts suggest that in some villages, households repurposed old clothing, weaving patchworks for additional insulation. Historians still argue whether patchwork bedding was born of necessity, fashion, or superstition, but you can feel the cumulative effect. Each layer traps air, each fold preserves heat, and each patch represents ingenuity and scarcity. You stretch your legs and notice that even minimal movement under blankets helps circulation, preventing frostbite and stiffness. Fringe tales hint that some villagers practiced micro-movements in their sleep, curling toes or flexing fingers to maintain warmth. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or instinctual, but trying it yourself, you feel a subtle difference, a small, private act of survival embedded in unconscious motion. The wind rattles outside, shaking windows and sending icy drafts through cracks, and you realize how essential sealing gaps was. Fringe evidence claims that some households stuffed moss, cloth scraps, or straw into crevices to block the cold. Historians still argue whether this was common or anecdotal, but the tactile ingenuity is obvious. Warmth depends not just on bodies and fire, but on preventing escape routes for cold. You observe how people tuck blankets tightly around shoulders, creating pockets of heat. Fringe accounts suggest that layering furs in staggered arrangements prevented drafts from sneaking in, a technique some modern survivalists rediscovered centuries later. Historians still argue whether such methods were widely known or localized innovation, but you notice how effective it feels, each fold a deliberate act against winter's bite. A small dog nestles at the edge of a bed, fermingling with human blankets. Fringe sources claim that pets were sometimes encouraged to sleep in direct contact with children, providing supplemental warmth. Historians still argue whether this was practical necessity or superstition, but you can feel the difference. Tiny bodies radiating heat, turning a simple bed into a shared furnace. You notice the rhythm of breathing in the room, a gentle pulse of collective warmth. Fringe accounts hint that some families aligned sleeping positions to maximize airflow and retain heat, almost like an early form of thermal architecture. Historians still argue whether these alignments were conscious or intuitive, but the outcome is undeniable. The room feels warmer as bodies coordinate silently, unconsciously. Small rituals emerge as people settle for the night. Fringe evidence suggests that some villagers whispered short prayers, recited chants, or tapped objects near the hearth, believing these actions locked heat inside the room. Historians still argue whether these rituals had practical effects or were purely psychological, but you notice the calm they instill. Warmth is not only physical, but mental, anchored in belief and routine. You realize how critical proximity is, pressing back to back, shoulders to arms, legs interwoven with blankets. Fringe sources claim that some families even taught children to instinctively huddle in ways that conserved maximum heat. Historians still argue whether such practices were codified or merely observational, but the result is visible, a collective system of survival in miniature. You notice subtle adjustments, sliding an arm closer, shifting a foot under a blanket, leaning slightly to block a draft. Fringe accounts suggest that such minor, nightly negotiations were essential for comfort and life, a quiet diplomacy conducted in frost and shadow. Historians still argue whether these routines were formalized or emergent, but the precision of each movement confirms the stakes. By the late evening, bodies are still, breaths measured, but the room pulses with retained warmth. Fringe tales hint that some families kept small hot stones or embers wrapped in cloth under blankets to supplement body heat. Historians still argue whether this was practical or rare, but you feel the ingenuity. Heat can be stored, moved, and applied creatively. Finally, as you tuck your head into a warm nest of furs, blankets, and bodies, you realize the lesson. Survival overnight is a choreography of physics, biology, and human ingenuity. Fringe sources suggest that some traditions became ceremonial over time, embedding practical survival strategies into daily life. Historians still argue whether these rituals arose from fear, observation, or culture, but in this moment, all you feel is warmth, security, and the subtle satisfaction of human persistence. You wake briefly to the faint creak of frost settling on the roof, a delicate reminder that winter hasn't surrendered. The warmth of bodies and blankets lulls you back into semi-consciousness, but you notice how important ventilation is. Without it, the air would become damp and suffocating. Fringe accounts suggest that some households cracked windows slightly, just enough to circulate fresh, cold air while retaining heat. Historians still argue whether this was widely practiced or only occasional, but the logic is clear. Survival is a careful balance between warmth and breathable air. You watch a neighbor rise silently, padding across the frozen floor to adjust the hearth. Fringe sources claim that some villagers maintained small embers overnight, coaxing them with a whisper of wind or an extra log to avoid losing the fire completely. Historians still argue whether overnight hearth management was common or a rarity, but seeing it in action emphasizes the delicacy of winter survival. A single ember can make the difference between discomfort and danger. You notice the clever layering of clothing and blankets, almost like human architecture. Fringe accounts suggest that people sometimes wore multiple layers of wool, linen, and fur simultaneously, each acting as insulation while allowing ventilation. Historians still argue whether layering systems were formally taught or intuitively adopted, but you can see the practical genius. Warmth is cumulative, and minor miscalculations can be costly. Outside, the wind howls against the cottage walls, a persistent adversary. Fringe tales claim that some communities would anchor furs or mats around doorways to prevent drafts and heat loss. Historians still argue whether this was standard practice or regional improvisation, but the result is obvious. Even minor interventions can drastically improve indoor survival conditions. You stretch under your blankets, noticing how body positioning plays a role. Fringe evidence hints that sleeping with arms close to the torso, legs tucked, and heads near heated spots conserve the most energy. Historians still argue whether these positions were instinctive or culturally transmitted, but the efficiency is tangible. Subtle adjustments in posture extend survival when temperatures drop. A small child stirs, pressing closer to an adult, generating additional heat. Fringe sources suggest that children were deliberately encouraged to sleep next to warm bodies, transferring vital warmth while also learning survival instincts through observation. Historians still argue whether this practice was universal or isolated, but you feel the wisdom. Heat is social, and proximity is survival. You glance at the arrangement of furs, blankets, and mats. Every layer seems intentional. Fringe accounts claim that some households use reflective surfaces, such as polished metal or baked clay, beneath bedding to retain warmth. Historians still argue whether these methods were broadly implemented or experimental, but the effect is practical. Heat can be captured, amplified, and redistributed. You feel the collective pulse of breathing, bodies rising and falling in a rhythm that seems almost synchronized. Fringe sources suggest that communities consciously placed sleeping arrangements to optimize airflow and prevent dampness from condensing on skin. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate or accidental, but the effect is undeniable. Warmth and moisture management are intertwined. Small whispers pass between sleepers, subtle instructions or reassurances. Fringe tales hint that some families developed quiet codes for shifts in sleeping positions, ensuring the coldest members move closer to residual heat. Historians still argue whether these systems were common or anecdotal, but you sense an emergent organization, a silent, human-engineered microclimate. You stretch fingers and toes, testing circulation, aware that subtle movement preserves extremities. Fringe sources claim that rhythmic flexing and curling of hands and feet was taught from childhood as a survival skill. Historians still argue whether this was universal knowledge or localized practice, but the effect is obvious. Movement, even small, maintains life against relentless cold. You notice that even animals contribute to the thermal ecosystem. Cats curl around children's shoulders, dogs nestle under blankets, and their combined body heat supplements human warmth. Fringe evidence suggests that some households trained pets specifically to lie in positions that maximized heat transfer. Historians still argue whether this was functional or cultural embellishment, but the practical outcome is undeniable. Survival is collaborative, extending beyond humans. The wind rattles windows and snow piles against the walls. Fringe accounts suggest that small mounds of snow around the exterior were sometimes intentionally left, acting as insulation by stabilizing temperatures. Historians still argue whether this practice was common or anecdotal, but you can see the principle. Even snow, the enemy outside, can be coaxed into aiding survival. You stretch once more, feeling the warmth seep from blankets, bodies, and small embers under furs. Fringe tales hint that some villagers used subtle rituals, tapping, whispering, or touching objects, to psychologically anchor heat and reduce anxiety. Historians still argue whether these rituals had practical effects, but the calming influence is clear. Survival is both physical and mental. Finally, as dawn approaches, you feel a delicate balance. The room is warm, bodies are rested, and survival is a mosaic of preparation, collaboration, and instinct. Fringe sources suggest that communities often documented these methods orally, passing down nuanced survival strategies through generations. Historians still argue whether these teachings were codified or simply observed, but one thing is clear. Enduring winter required meticulous attention, creativity, and collective human effort. You rise to greet the morning, the frost still heavy on the window panes, and notice how daylight, though faint, changes the room's dynamics. Even in winter, sunlight offers more than vision. It contributes to subtle warmth and morale. Fringe accounts suggest that villagers would arrange beds, furs, and cooking fires to maximize exposure to scarce sun rays. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were intentional or coincidental, but the effect is tangible. Even a weak sunbeam can lift spirits and slightly boost body heat. You trudge outside to check on the firewood pile, the cold biting sharply against your cheeks. Fringe sources claim that some communities covered stockpiles with tarps, moss, or snow to prevent moisture from freezing the wood solid. Historians still argue whether this practice was standard or improvised, but the logic is clear. Dry wood is life, and preparation begins long before nightfall. The village is stirring. Children dash through snow-packed paths, their small bodies radiating heat and energy. Fringe accounts suggest that morning tasks were deliberately organized to minimize prolonged exposure, alternating between indoor and outdoor duties. Historians still argue whether these schedules were formal or flexible, but observing the rhythm, you see the careful balance of efficiency and safety. You carry water back from a nearby frozen stream, balancing it carefully to prevent spills and freezing. Fringe tales hint that villagers sometimes layered containers with insulating materials like straw or cloth to delay freezing. Historians still argue whether this technique was widespread or exceptional, but the principle is straightforward. Small innovations compound into survival advantages. Breakfast preparation begins, and you notice the choreography of fire tending, meal stirring, and heat preservation. Fringe sources claim that certain rituals were incorporated into morning routines, such as stirring clockwise for good warmth or blowing on embers to coax energy. Historians still argue whether these were functional superstitions or purely symbolic, but the cumulative effect, both psychological and thermal, is clear. Children are given high-calorie breakfasts, small dense morsels designed to fuel motion and warmth throughout the morning. Fringe accounts suggest that in some communities, elders carefully monitored portions, balancing energy expenditure with the caloric value of limited food. Historians still argue whether rationing systems were formalized or intuitive, but you notice that nutrition and heat are inseparable. Fuel your body, and it becomes its own furnace. You notice neighbors exchanging items, sharing small portions of food, and assisting each other with tasks. Fringe evidence hints that communal cooperation was as much about social survival as thermal survival, building bonds that helped endure long winters. Historians still argue whether this sense of community was universal or culturally specific, but you feel its truth. Survival is deeply intertwined with collaboration. You trudge across icy paths to inspect insulation on homes, noticing that walls and roofs are reinforced with mud, straw, or animal hides. Fringe accounts suggest that some families layered materials strategically, creating microclimates that reduced heat loss. Historians still argue whether these architectural methods were widespread or experimental, but their effect is obvious. Warmth can be engineered, even without modern technology. Children play briefly in the snow, but the activity is balanced with warm breaks near fires or inside homes. Fringe sources claim that this rotation of activity and rest was taught to prevent energy depletion and frostbite. Historians still argue whether it was intentional pedagogy or instinctive practice, but watching it, you recognize the rhythm. Survival is a careful management of heat, effort, and rest. You pause at the edge of a frozen pond, noticing tracks left by wildlife. Fringe evidence hints that some villagers monitored animal movements as both food sources and indicators of terrain safety, subtly adjusting travel routes to avoid dangerous patches of ice. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal, but the ingenuity of integrating observation into survival is clear. You carry more supplies back to the hearth, arranging them carefully to dry and preserve heat. Fringe accounts suggest that certain herbs or materials were placed near embers not for cooking, but for their supposed warming properties when inhaled or touched. Historians still argue whether this was psychological or practical, but you breathe in the scent, feeling a subtle comfort. The village hums with coordinated activity, fetching water, tending fires, checking insulation, preparing meals. Fringe tales hint that even mundane tasks were optimized over generations. Small routines encoding survival wisdom. Historians still argue whether these routines were consciously designed or evolved naturally, but the efficiency is evident. Human ingenuity thrives under pressure. By mid-morning, the cold is relentless but manageable. You feel a sense of rhythm, a dance of motion, warmth, food, and community that sustains life. Fringe accounts suggest that some villages maintained informal morning councils, a brief gathering to coordinate essential tasks and share observations. Historians still argue whether this was ceremonial or functional, but you notice how effective collective planning is. Winter survival is not random, it's organized. Finally, you pause near the hearth with a cup of warm broth, observing the interplay of firelight, shadow, and motion. Fringe evidence claims that small rituals, such as gently tapping embers or whispering to the fire, were thought to enhance longevity of warmth. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or early science, but in the cozy bubble of home, the combination of preparation, cooperation, and ingenuity feels almost magical. You notice the sun is dipping low again, casting long, pale shadows across the snow-covered village. Evening signals the next challenge: conserving heat while preparing for another night of frost. Fringe accounts claim that in some regions, villagers performed ritualistic checks of firewood, bedding, and clothing each evening, almost like a winter checklist. Historians still argue whether these routines were formalized or arose from habit, but the purpose is clear. Preparation maximizes comfort and survival. You trudge through icy streets, carrying supplies from one home to another. Fringe evidence suggests that some northern settlements created relay systems for heavy loads, reducing individual exposure to the cold. Historians still argue whether these systems were widely practiced or situational, but seeing neighbors cooperate efficiently, you recognize a lesson in communal endurance. Even a small act, like sharing the burden of a firewood bundle, becomes crucial. Back inside, you observe the choreography of household preparation. Furs are shaken, straw is fluffed, embers stoked, and small lamps lit. Fringe sources claim that some communities would strategically rotate these tasks, ensuring that no single person spent too long in freezing drafts. Historians still argue whether this rotation was systematic or intuitive, but you see the wisdom. Survival is a delicate balance of labor, warmth, and rest. You notice children helping, placing small sticks in the fire or adjusting blankets, learning techniques through observation and imitation. Fringe accounts hint that early education in thermal survival was hands-on, skills passed down quietly by demonstration rather than formal instruction. Historians still argue whether this training was culturally codified or learned instinctively, but the results are evident. The young internalize strategies for enduring winter without explicit teaching. The wind rattles windows as you arrange extra furs on sleeping areas. Fringe sources suggest that some families used multiple layers of blankets and clothing to trap both body heat and ambient warmth from the hearth. Historians still argue whether such layering methods were consciously applied or evolved by trial and error, but the effect is immediately noticeable. Layering multiplies heat retention exponentially. You glance at neighbors, noting subtle variations. Some wrap themselves tightly in furs, while others huddle in clusters to share warmth. Fringe accounts suggest that these variations reflect personal experience, family traditions, or experimental strategies. Historians still argue whether these differences were culturally determined or individually adapted, but the diversity itself shows human flexibility in solving survival challenges. You notice small lamps casting faint glows across the room. Fringe evidence claims that lamp placement could create microclimates, warming sleeping areas and workspaces without burning excessive fuel. Historians still argue whether lamp choreography was deliberate or emergent, but the results speak for themselves. Small, thoughtful interventions enhance comfort drastically. You sip warm broth while tending a dying ember, the liquid both nourishing and heat-conserving. Fringe tales suggest that liquids were carefully portioned to prolong internal warmth and maintain energy for evening tasks. Historians still argue whether the timing and composition of meals were standardized or intuitive, but it's clear that nourishment and heat are inseparable allies. Children curl close to adults, and small pets nestling under blankets. Fringe sources claim that animals were deliberately included in sleeping arrangements to supplement human heat. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal, but the principle is undeniable. Every source of warmth counts. You notice the quiet negotiations, who sleeps where, how blankets are distributed, which ember will be saved for midnight. Fringe evidence suggests that in some households, sleeping arrangements rotated nightly to optimize warmth for all family members. Historians still argue whether such rotations were strictly observed or flexible, but the system is effective. Coordination matters as much as insulation. You walk briefly to inspect windows and doors, plugging small drafts with cloth and straw. Fringe accounts suggest that minor improvisations like these were crucial, preventing heat from escaping and cold from infiltrating. Historians still argue whether households universally applied such tactics or only in extreme conditions, but you feel the difference immediately. Small measures compound into substantial comfort. You take a moment to observe the rhythm of evening chores: fire tending, broth stirring, blanket fluffing, ember coaxing. Fringe sources hint that routines created a mental map of survival, reducing anxiety and ensuring no essential task is forgotten. Historians still argue whether this mapping was deliberate or emergent, but the psychological and practical value is evident. As darkness deepens, the village settles into a shared rhythm, huddling, sipping, adjusting, whispering, and listening. Fringe tales suggest that subtle rituals, tapping embers, adjusting blankets in a specific order, serve both practical and psychological functions. Historians still argue whether these rituals were functional or symbolic, but they undeniably reinforce comfort and security. Finally, as you curl under furs, sipping the last of your warm drink, you feel the full weight of human ingenuity. Layered insulation, coordinated movement, shared body heat, preserved embers, and collective rituals. Fringe accounts hint that such nightly routines became embedded in culture, a survival manual passed down orally. Historians still argue whether codification occurred or knowledge remained intuitive, but one thing is clear. In a winter without heating, the fusion of preparation, collaboration, and instinct keeps life going. You wake to the quietest part of the night, when the village lies suspended in frost and shadow, and every sound, creaking beams, distant wind, soft breathing, feels amplified. You notice how the previous routines, preparations, and strategies now converge. Bodies tucked in, furs layered, embers smoldering, lamps glowing faintly. Fringe accounts suggest that this precise combination of insulation, shared warmth, movement, and psychological ritual created a microclimate sufficient for survival. Historians still argue whether such systems were deliberate inventions or evolved instinctively over generations. But in this moment, you feel their genius. You glance at a child curled beside an elder, blankets tucked carefully around both. Fringe evidence hints that the warmth of one person could transfer incrementally through a chain of sleepers, a primitive but highly effective thermal relay. Historians still argue whether these chains were commonly used or only observed occasionally, but the principle resonates. Survival is both collective and cumulative. Every body, every breath, every subtle shift of position matters. You stretch your hands and feet slowly under layers of fur, feeling the circulation restoring warmth. Fringe accounts suggest that micro-movements in sleep, curling toes, flexing fingers, rolling shoulders, were observed and encouraged in some communities to reduce frostbite risk. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal, but the effect is undeniable. Even subtle action sustains life. The smell of smoldering embers and dried herbs fills the room, reminding you that survival relied on more than body heat alone. Fringe sources claim that households strategically placed herbs near embers for both warmth and psychological comfort. Historians still argue whether this was ritual, practical, or both, but you inhale deeply and feel reassured. Warmth is both tangible and symbolic. You notice the quiet choreography of sleeping arrangements, head-to-foot positioning, rotational huddling, and the careful inclusion of small animals to enhance collective heat. Fringe tales suggest that over generations, families learned optimal configurations, passing knowledge orally. Historians still argue whether this wisdom was codified or purely observational, but the effectiveness is apparent. Strategy turns discomfort into survivable nights. The room hums with a subtle rhythm, the rise and fall of breathing, the occasional shuffle, the faint crackle of embers. Fringe accounts hint that families silently monitored these cues, adjusting sleeping arrangements or adding small amounts of fuel when necessary. Historians still argue whether such monitoring was instinctual or consciously planned, but the result is a delicate, living equilibrium against the cold. You notice how even small gestures, tucking a blanket, repositioning a hand, nudging a foot, contribute to comfort and warmth. Fringe evidence claims that these minute acts were transmitted as survival folk wisdom, teaching younger generations through observation and imitation. Historians still argue whether formal instruction existed, but the principle is clear. Attentiveness to detail can make the difference between discomfort and life. The wind rattles the exterior walls, yet the interior feels protected, almost cocooned by the combination of bodies, insulation, and vigilance. Fringe sources suggest that some communities strategically piled snow outside to stabilize temperatures, reinforcing the house's thermal envelope. Historians still argue whether this was widely practiced or experimental, but the idea underscores a truth. Every layer, inside or outside, matters in winter survival. You notice the subtle glow of lamps and embers reflecting across polished surfaces, amplifying both light and psychological warmth. Fringe accounts claim that these reflections were considered vital to maintaining morale, especially during the longest nights. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or a happy coincidence, but the effect is immediate. Even faint light becomes a symbol of safety. By the final hours before dawn, you feel a sense of awe at the orchestration. Human ingenuity, observation, collaboration, and ritual all converging to transform relentless frost into something tolerable. Fringe evidence hints that these nightly routines, positioning, layering, monitoring, micro-movements, and ritual, formed a survival culture passed through generations. Historians still argue whether these were codified lessons or adaptive behaviors, but you recognize the legacy: endurance through knowledge, observation, and ingenuity. You stretch, breathe slowly, and allow the warmth of bodies, blankets, and embers to seep fully into your bones. Fringe accounts suggest that even brief lapses in vigilance could have dire consequences, underscoring the precision and care involved. Historians still argue whether survival practices were universally followed or flexible, but tonight, every precaution, every small act has paid off. Finally, as dawn approaches, you feel the culmination of all efforts: collective resilience, strategic improvisation, and intimate knowledge of body, fire, and environment. Fringe sources hint that these combined methods were as much about preserving mental fortitude as physical heat. Historians still argue whether psychological support was formally recognized or incidental, but the effect is undeniable. Surviving winter required both body and mind working in tandem. The snow outside softens in the first pale light of morning, a quiet sigh after a long, relentless night. You feel the room expand with warmth, not just from embers or blankets, but from the living pulse of everyone around you. Muscles relax, and the steady rhythm of breathing, previously a tool for survival, becomes a gentle lullaby. The cold that once pressed against walls and windows now feels distant, softened by layers of human ingenuity, cooperation, and attention. You notice the subtle sense of smoldering herbs and warming broth, mingling in the air like a comforting embrace. Your body stretches further into the furs, absorbing the residual heat of neighbors and pets alike. Even small movements feel like triumphs. Curling fingers, flexing toes, and shifting gently under blankets. All tiny acts of mastery over frost. You can almost hear the whispers of past generations, the shared knowledge encoded in sleeping positions, layered furs, and nightly routines. The room is quiet, but not empty. Every breath, every subtle shift resonates with resilience. Outside, the wind continues its song, but you no longer feel threatened. The world beyond these walls is vast and cold. Yet here, warmth is woven through human attention and ingenuity. Each ember, each whispered instruction, each careful layering of blankets has contributed to this fragile sanctuary. Your heartbeat slows, syncing with the gentle pulse of the room. You realize that surviving the harshest winter is not only about firewood, furs, or movement. It's about trust, observation, and subtle rituals that preserve both body and mind. As the light deepens, you close your eyes briefly, letting the warmth and calm settle completely. The snow will continue to fall, the cold will persist, yet within this space, you are cocooned, buoyed by human resourcefulness and shared endurance. Your body, your mind, and your spirit rest in quiet harmony, ready to meet the day with renewed resilience and gentle,